June 21st, 2010, Baltimore. My mom died yesterday morning. She was 99 and had started to not feel well over the past 6 months. She was otherwise in great health for her age, but her body finally gave out. I came up to Baltimore with the hope that I would see her before she passed away, but I didn't get here in time. For someone who held on to life with dignity and grace for so long, she went very quickly in the end. My mother had a long and vital life. She was born in Oklahoma City and grew up in Brunswick on the coast of Georgia. She would tell me stories about the Sea Islands, Jekyll and St. Simon's. She and her family would go crabbing, and she said it was as easy as throwing a piece of bait in the ocean and pulling the creatures in. There were just so many of them. She also told me about watching the sea turtles come ashore and lay their eggs. They did this at night. The beach was silvery from the moonlight, and the huge turtles would lumber up to the dunes and dig deep holes in the sand where they laid their eggs. Then they would leave and return to the sea. She said it was an amazing sight. There is a beach on Jekyll Island that is covered with driftwood, like large skeletons from some prehistoric animals, like sculptures. They create shapes and shadows against the sand. She described this beach to me, and then I saw it later, traveling from Houston to Charlotte. This is a picture of my mother when she was 7 months old. Ella Katherine Hodges was born in 1910. She had a sister, Pauline, who we called Auntie Paula. Sometime along the way, my mother dropped the Ella and was just plain Katherine. These were my mother's paternal grandparents, Grandma Kelly Hodges and Grandpa Hodges. And these were my mother's maternal grandparents. The Garners were French Huguenots. My mother was a mix of French, English, and Irish. This is Mr. and Mrs. Garner. These are my mother's parents. I knew them as Grandmother and Papa John. Family history has it that my grandmother was a direct descendant of Theodosia Lee, that is, the sister to Light Horse Harry Lee and aunt to Robert E. Lee. It was true that my grandmother's family was from Virginia and moved to Tennessee and Georgia after the Civil War. There was some mystery also about my grandmother and my mother's sister, Pauline. Papa John was not Pauline's father. The girls were half-sisters, but they adored each other. Pauline was gentle and mild. My mother was vibrant and full of energy. I remember my mother telling me that even though her sister was the kindest and most loving person she knew, when Pauline got angry, she could pout for hours and it would be just infuriating. My mother was beloved by everyone who knew her. She was charming and engaging and always took an interest in others. My mother was always proud that she had been a Hopkins nurse. After my father died, she moved back to Baltimore. And as an alumna of the university, she was invited to join the prestigious Hopkins Club. Not because of my father, but on her own merit. My mother met my father in Baltimore. He was doing his residency at Johns Hopkins. She was a psychiatric nurse. The story of their meeting and falling in love was legend in our family. It goes like this. They met on an elevator at Johns Hopkins. It was the end of the night shift, and he asked her if she liked it, and she answered, "I hate it with a passion." And the doors opened, and she left. The comment intrigued my father, and he looked for her the following evening. However, that had been her last night on night duty. He did track her down, and they went on a couple of dates. He asked her to marry him, but she said she couldn't possibly consider such a thing. Then, as my mother tells it, she woke up the next morning and thought, "What a beautiful day for a wedding." And with that, they got married. It was 11 days after they had met. My father always called my mother Georgia. She went by that name the whole time they were married. But when he died, she stopped using it. She became Katherine once again. This is a letter my niece, Katherine Feldman, found in my mother's room as we were clearing it out in the days immediately after her death. We all knew the story of how my mother and my father met, fell in love, and married in little over a week. But none of us knew about this letter. My mother had carried it around with her for at least 7 decades. My parents' relationship was deep and intense. It sometimes felt as if there was only room for the two of them. My father was very demanding, but my mother could be opinionated and stubborn. She could also be very provocative. She could jab your feelings with a verbal barb, and somehow she always found a way to provoke my father. However, even with all of the drama, what was always evident was a deep and abiding affection between them. My mother was never mean. She just had a slightly sly sense of humor. She saw the good and the bad, the ugly and the beautiful. As my father aged, he became very ill. He was a manic depressive, and his condition worsened with each year. My mother was kind, but she could also be critical, softened by Southern grace. But you were expected to live up to standards of moral and ethical behavior, and to adhere to appearances in the cause of social harmony. My mother was able to be all of these things. These characteristics never clashed in her. She pulled off the contrasts of her ways with a cultural adeptness that could leave you breathless. My mother never stopped loving my father. Never. He died in 1979. She survived him for 3 decades. And she would tell me, whenever I questioned her love, that she had had over 20 years of bliss with my father, and his subsequent illness could not rob her of that. She would always be grateful for that experience. Her loyalty and her love could not be shaken. June 24th, 2010, Baltimore. It is a very profound experience going through my mother's belongings, dismantling a life, sending it forth into another place and time. It is a journey learning how to come to terms with such loss, and I am moving through it and beginning to see the beauty in the transience, a sort of resonance of presence that is beyond the material. The jagged disruption, the horrible physical trauma is leaving, although the sadness never departs. My mother was a homemaker, a housewife. That's what she called herself, and she was proud of it. She managed the household and the family. It was her vocation. Her home was her work, and she spent a great deal of effort on fulfilling her role. My mother was beautiful, strong, creative, fun, and resourceful. She lived fully in the moment with wit and grace. She was full of dignity and charm. My mother was always present. She left an indelible mark on all that surrounded her, creating light everywhere she went. Her eyes sparkled, and her smile was beguiling and warm, engaging and full of delight. She lit up the world. She was a fun mother. She always had us doing projects, creating and making things. But she also let us roam freely through the woods nearby and the surrounding meadows. It was a magical childhood. My mother read to us a lot. Some of my most beloved memories were sitting on the couch in the living room listening to a story. I especially remember laughing hysterically over the story of Winnie the Pooh and the Heffalump. In this picture, my mother is reading to my brothers, Michael, Richard, John, Louis, and my sister Joan. That's me in the left-hand corner. I came along 2 years after Richard. I see my mother standing by the stove, stirring a pot of something delicious. Olive oil, garlic, onions, basil and wine. Aroma of baking and cooking filling the kitchen. Bread, cakes, pies, stews, roasts, braised chicken and veal, pancakes, waffles, melted butter and warm maple syrup, deep dark molasses cake with hot chocolate on a cold day after skating or sledding, or picnics with fried chicken, potato salad, coleslaw, and deviled eggs, measuring flour, currants for saffron bread, chopping candied lemon peel. I see her cutting out patterns, sitting at the sewing machine, making seams straight and long into blouses, skirts, dresses, and shirts. Sitting in the living room by the fire, making Christmas ornaments, decorating cookies, Santa, reindeer, evergreen trees, angels, holly, with coconut, raisins, lemon peel, cinnamon buttons, and assorted sprinkles. These are images of me and my mother over the years. I look to be about 3 in the first picture. She would have been 44. We are sitting out in the garden at 10 Allison Lane. In the next picture, I was 9, and we were out shopping. She would have been 50. In the third picture, we are standing in front of 10 Allison Lane just before my confirmation. For me, that would be age 12, and for my mother, 56. Then we are outside the Church of the Advent in my wedding photograph 20 years later. The final image is a picture of us together at brunch in Houston. I had recently turned 40, and she was 81. You can just see Jules, my mother's last grandchild. She had 13 altogether. This is my mother and me, 2 months before she died. In this picture, I'm 58 and she is 99. This was a special visit. I brought a jigsaw puzzle and my laptop with me so that I could be occupied while she was resting. I would alternate between activities, and she would sit in the armchair next to me, and doze off. She was having a very hard time, and she was very tired. She couldn't see well, and her hearing was very limited. She helped me piece together the edge of the puzzle by feeling which pieces had the straight sides. Along with reading, cooking, and gardening, I gained my love of doing puzzles from her. When we used to go to the beach house in West Hampton, on rainy days, we always did puzzles together. She would identify the pieces by their shape. Now, where is that piece that looks like a puppy dog? In the retirement community where my mother lived, she had a garden. My mother was one of those people around whom plants just grew wildly. In the garden she and my father kept in Pleasantville at 10 Allison Lane, there were columbines, bleeding heart, roses, verbena, peonies, lily of the valley, phlox, iris, tiger lilies, daylilies, salvia, shasta daisies. There were forsythia and lilacs, Japanese maples and dogwood. No redbud, though. Doesn't grow in the north. The first time I saw a redbud tree was on a trip with my mother when I was about 36. She and I drove from Baltimore to Knoxville, Tennessee, and then to Georgia to visit her southern cousins, her sister, her nieces, and her nephew. It was April, and as we traveled along I-81, I marveled at these beautiful trees covered with purple blooms, a purple that ranged from magenta to soft lavender with highlights of white. It was the most beautiful color I had ever seen. And there were hundreds of them all along the road for miles and miles. And I asked her, "What are those trees?" And she said, "Oh, those are Judas trees, or redbuds. Aren't they lovely? They were always my favorite." And I wondered how I could have lived so long without ever having seen one. Now I see them all the time, and every one of them reminds me of my mother.